אני יכול לעשות את הנאום הזה בעברית, אבל אני חושב שזה פחות אפקטיבי, ויותר טוב אם אני עובר לאנגלית. אז ברשותכם אני אדבר באנגלית. So, Eric, thank you very much indeed for your very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with so many of you today to talk about what I think is a revolution which Israel can play a role in leading. And Hanoch Barkat is here. He and I were privileged to work at APACS together. We set up APACS in 1993. The fund was launched in 1994, when high-tech was just a dream on the horizon in Israel. And you can see how we've benefited in recent days from Israeli technology. And Israel has managed to do better in the technology area than European countries, such as Britain and Germany, which had at the start the prospect of doing a lot better than Israel. And I think in the social area, for the same reasons, this meeting may turn out to be a watershed, because we're moving not only from investment to social impact, but from philanthropy to social investment. And the reason we're moving is one that I'd like to spend a few minutes telling you about. And then I'll move on to talk about what we've done in the UK and what it is that we should all together try to do here in Israel, in my view. The goal is obviously to improve people's lives. If you look historically, there have been social issues forever. Around about 1917, governments began to realize that the role of philanthropy was extremely important in dealing with social issues. And so in the United States in 1917, they gave tax breaks to philanthropic foundations. And that was the beginning of the endowments that we see today. Today in the United States, as a result of this legislation passed in 1917, which gave a tax advantage to people who invested or who donated to their charitable foundations, we have $700 billion in the United States on the balance sheets of foundations. In the UK, there's 100 billion pounds. Here in Israel, we haven't had the same rules, we haven't had the same tax incentives, and there aren't really major endowments, but there are things that are similar, and we'll be talking about some of them here today. So philanthropy has run nearly for 100 years. And yet, although philanthropy has done fantastic things, and the founders of many of these foundations, like the Rockefeller Foundation, or the Ford Foundation, or the Wellcome Trust in the UK, would have been extremely proud to see how much good their foundations have been able to do. When you look at social issues today, we can see that they continue to persist, and in many cases have become aggravated over the last century. In the mid-1940s, just after the war, in fact, in the middle of the war, it started with William Beveridge in the UK, government said, we have to do it ourselves. Philanthropy is fine. We need to take on the task of dealing with social issues. And the welfare state, the formal welfare state, began to take on the responsibilities for health, for education, for unemployment, and so on and so forth. And today, what can we say about governments? We can say that governments are out of cash and out of breath. Out of cash because of the financial crisis. Israel is better off than the United States, the UK, the whole of Europe. But still, governments, even the Israeli government, doesn't have the money to expend on social issues that it should. And we can see with the mechaot of the summer of a year ago that people feel very strongly about it, and yet government is not really able to provide the solution. And so we are today in a position where both philanthropy and government are asking themselves big questions about what to do with social issues. Now, in 2000, I got a telephone call from the British, from the Treasury, from the Otsar in Britain, saying to me, you've been a venture capitalist, you've looked at innovation, can you look at the issue of poverty in the UK? Can you lead a task force to look at how we deal with poverty? And I had been aware of the fact that APACs, where we had backed very successfully entrepreneurs who'd made huge amounts of money, and where we had brought an answer to governments' big question at the time, which is how do you create jobs? In the UK, when I started out in 1972, a long time ago now, there were 3 million unemployed. And government thought that the role of government in creating employment was to reorganize the big companies in the country. If they were loss-making, like the car companies, to bring them together, to give them funding. And that strategy didn't work. And government was asking itself questions about how do we create jobs? And venture capital and entrepreneurship came and said, you know what, creating jobs is not a government edict. It's not from the top down, it's from the bottom up. It's creating incentives for people to take risk, incentives for people to get rich. It's entrepreneurship, it's innovation, it's capital markets. And if you look at where we stand today, we're in a similar place. Government is saying to itself, we can't really solve social issues from the top down. The system that we've created, the capitalist system that we've created, became apparent to me at APACs long before I got the phone call from the Treasury, that it's a system which increases the average standard of living, but in doing so, through entrepreneurship, creates an increasing gap between rich and poor. And that poses very major problems for social cohesion, because there's a feeling of unfairness, of inequity in society that begins to corrode its values. And going back as long as 2002, at the 30th anniversary of APACs, I made a speech in which I said, which was our anniversary speech, look, it's great to see private equity and venture capital doing such great things. But if we don't address as a society social issues in a more effective way, then a curtain of fire will come to divide the rich from the poor. In our countries, in regions, in continents, in cultures. And so the reason we're here today is that a revolution needs to take place in the way that we deal with social issues. What is the revolution? The revolution is to develop a part of the system to take responsibility for dealing with social issues. Now, between the private sector, excellent, thank you. Between the private sector and the social sector, perfect. Between the private sector and the social, between the private sector and the public sector, there is a huge social sector, right? In the United States, this is a sector of not-for-profits which employ 9 million people. As I already said, there are $700 billion of assets. 9 million people and $700 billion of assets is a very significant sector. In Britain, the figures are proportionately only slightly smaller. 100 billion pounds of assets and 800,000 people working in not-for-profits. Across Europe, I don't have the figure for assets, but there are 11 million people working in not-for-profits. And yet, as many of you in this hall know, the common characteristic of the social sector is what? No one has any money. How many social organizations can look ahead more than 3 months? My work on the Social Investment Task Force convinced me that more than 3/4 of social organizations do not have sufficient funding to look further than 3 months. And why is that? That is because the philanthropic model basically said, you know what? You can't really measure your improvement of social issues. We'll give you money for 2 to 3 years. The sanity check is that you then go and convince someone else to give you money. And by the way, don't spend any of the money on your overheads. Now, if somebody at APACs had come and said to me, I want to build, or in Eric's Life had come to him, or Benny's life, or Itzik's life, and said, I want to build a major organization. I'm not going to spend any money on my overheads. We'd have said, you know, this person's not thinking straight. We'd have shown them the door. The combination of these values in donors' minds has meant that very few social organizations have been able to achieve scale. And this is what we realized as we worked on the Social Investment Task Force. So the concept developed in our minds, if the strength of capitalism is capital and entrepreneurship, and if social issues are so important to our society, why not try to harness the forces of capital and entrepreneurship to deal with social issues, to back social entrepreneurs? Why shouldn't a social entrepreneur have the same access to capital that a business entrepreneur can get? Because if you could manage to achieve that, you would begin to attract the sort of effort from existing organizations, from entrance into the social sector, to scale up to deal with social issues effectively. So in 2000, we recommended to the government that the way forward now was to develop this new field of social investment. That in order to do this, you had to take a leaf out of what had been done for venture capital investment and for business entrepreneurs. You had to create a system that supports the development of this activity. So in venture capital, many of you were not around in 1993, and here we had to create the Yozma scheme in order to get the industry going. We had to create legal structures for funds, which were replicable legal structures, easily implemented. We had to do the same in the UK. We had to create in the United States in 1970 NASDAQ for businesses that have not made a profit to raise capital to fund their growth. Without NASDAQ, there would not have been a venture capital industry in the United States. There would not have been a venture capital industry in Israel without NASDAQ, right? We had to get pension funds to accept changed legislation, changed regulation in the United States in 1978, which was called the ERISA legislation, which said a prudent pension fund manager managing the investments of the fund would invest in venture capital. And if he or she didn't, they ought to explain why they didn't invest in venture capital, right? So we created a whole system which developed the private equity industry to what it is today, an industry that has deployed trillions of dollars. We want to do the same thing for social organizations such as those you lead, and for investment organizations such as those you lead, and for philanthropic foundations such as those you lead. Now, how do you do it? You have to begin with innovation. The first innovation in the UK in 2002, 2 years after the task force, was to say we will create funds like the Apax funds, like many of our competitors' funds, but they will invest only in the poorest 25% of Britain. Okay? We're going to prove that entrepreneurship knows no social boundaries, no educational boundaries, that the levels of motivation in poorer areas are even higher than the levels of motivation in the mainstream economy. And we created a first fund of £40 million in 2002 to do that. Today, cutting a long story short, Bridges has over £300 million under management, is delivering 15% net IRR. The most powerful role model created by Bridges in the last decade is Karen Darby, a single mother of 3 who left school at 16 with no academic qualifications and turned £300,000 into £22 million in 3 years. She discovered, because she'd worked in a call center, the ability to call consumers at a time when utilities were being liberalized and you were getting competition in the telecommunications area, in the electricity area, in the water area, in the gas supply area. And she used a cost comparison engine, and she called householders from poorer areas, and she said, give me the details of your bill, I'll save you 30%. And in switching from one supplier to another, she got a commission. So the Bridges venture fund that invested in Karen put in £300,000 and took out £7 million. She made £7 million, and so did her business partner. But I could give you a number of other powerful examples. The Hoxton Hotel. The Hoxton Hotel, near Hoxton Square, one of the poorest areas of London. A hotel where the rooms are small, the size of a ship's cabin. There are no facilities downstairs except for a franchised restaurant, very small lobby area, so very economical in terms of utilization of space. Variable pricing. If the weekends are very free, you could stay there for £5. EasyJet style pricing. We made 9 times our money. The business was sold out for £60 million. The gym, startup within Bridges. Gyms in poorer areas, instead of charging £60 a month, charging £14.99 a month. Instead of £200 membership fee, no membership fee. Instead of being open 7 to 8, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No facilities for changing or showering or whatever else. 200 machines, 15,000 square feet. We're signing up 6,000 members before we open. There's talk now, we invested so far up to £12 million in the company. There's talk of our selling out in the press for £100 million. So what did we discover? And I think it's important for those of you who come from the financial world to appreciate this. We discovered that when you invest in a poorer area, the business models are more capital effective and more price sensitive. They therefore have a competitive advantage relative to models in the mainstream economy. They can grow faster with less capital. And we used to worry about how are we going to exit these businesses. We used to worry about having structures that involved debt which could somehow be repaid by the business. In fact, strategic buyers are very happy to buy these businesses. So here was one small step in innovation. But it wasn't the biggest step that's been taken. The biggest step that was taken was through social finance, which I'm proud to say I co-founded and started in the basement of my office in London. Through social finance in 2007, we began to address the issue of how do you connect a social performance to a financial return. This is with the benefit, I'm expressing it with the benefit of hindsight, but basically we were looking for some way of funding social organizations that provided a financial return. And that's what's involved, connecting the two. We recruited one person at the start in 2007 who had been my assistant, the secretary of the Social Investment Task Force. We went up to 18 people. There are now 35 people at Social Finance UK. And in 2010, we agreed with the government on the first social impact bond. How many of you know how a social impact bond works? Can you just raise your hands? Not many of you. So here is the innovation. Am I speaking too fast, or is this good? Good? So here is the innovation. We went to the government and we said to the government, look, you have a big prisoner problem. Young prisoners, when released from jail, reoffend, 66% of them, in the UK and in the United States and everywhere, roughly 2/3 of them, reoffend within 1 year of release. Okay? So we will raise, we Social Finance UK, a social investment bank, if you like, which we started with £2 million of philanthropic money. We will raise £5 million. And we will fund not-for-profit organizations, not-for-profits, 3 or 4 of them. We will invest the £5 million over 3 or 4 years, giving more money as we think fit to one organization rather than the other one that we've backed. We'll sign an agreement with you, the Ministry of Justice. If over the 6 to 8 year life of the bond, we are unable to reduce the rate of reoffending by more than 7.5%, the money's lost. But if we reduce it by 7.5% to 15%, then government will pay back the £5 million and will pay a rate of return on that £5 million that goes from 2.5% to 13%, according to the reduction achieved. And the punchline is government will be paying out roughly 1/3 of the total saving. So all of a sudden you have a financial instrument that transforms the life of a not-for-profit. All of a sudden, the St. Giles Trust, the Ormiston Trust, the YMCA, whom we funded in the first round, we've now had 2 years of this first social impact bond. These organizations began to focus on how can we manage to achieve a 7% yield on our bond, 7% or more. If we can pay 7% on a bond, uncorrelated with equity markets, there are going to be tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of pounds in the world that will come to address social issues, and we can have our share of them. We can scale up. The St. Giles Trust had got up to about £40 million of revenues a year, I think, from memory, in about 40 years. You could now begin to think of being a £200 million revenue organization. If you could manage to deliver results on the first £5 million bond, and you could really show that you had got reductions in reoffending of 15% plus, you can go back to the market and raise a £10 million bond, a £20 million bond. And if you look today at the way the management of the St. Giles Trust is focusing on improvement of the social issue that it is, that it's dedicated to, the information system that is coming out looks like the information system of a high-tech firm. You've got, or any other firm, any other properly run business, you've got bar charts and you've got graphs about what are the problems that the prisoners face. 40% of them face an accommodation need. How can you hope to deal with recidivism if you're not dealing with accommodation? Up until then, everybody knew that accommodation was part of the question, but nobody had really focused on it. 30% roughly of the prisoners had insufficient money on release. They get about £45 to make it through to the first government check. 25% had nowhere to sleep the night and problems with their families. 18% had a drug issue. And so you began to see attention focused on how you can achieve better social performance. Fine. That innovation today is leading to about 25 social impact bond issues across the world. As Eric said, we have been involved internationally in pushing this. We have social finance in the UK, we have social finance in the US, we're now creating social finance here in Israel. We are pushing in Australia, where 3 social impact bond issues have been announced. We're pushing in Germany, where the Bertelsmann Foundation is becoming extremely interested in this whole area. And in Canada, we're beginning to get ministers who are talking about it. And so we're beginning to see that there is a better understanding of the challenge ahead of us and how these financial instruments can really help. In the last couple of months, Mike Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs, two iconic names in the world of American capitalism, put up $10 million for a social impact bond to deal with prisoners in the United States. Now New York State is about to announce a social impact bond. A social impact bond of a different kind, where the underwriting of the security has been achieved through a bank. So a bank has said, I will provide the social organization with the money if investors don't invest, and where a foundation will come in to take a first loss of 15%. This begins to say to pension fund managers, you know what? If I've got 15% protection on the way down and I can make 10 or 12% on my bond, why shouldn't I invest in this? Okay? But as I said earlier, this innovation in itself isn't going to be sufficient to develop the market, which needs an infrastructure. And social returns don't attract capital in the way that financial returns do. So you need a social investment bank, and we identified this in 2000. You need a social investment bank that is capable of taking the responsibility for funding social organizations and to help them to underwrite their bonds when necessary, but also to help investment managers to create funds which are dedicated to supporting social entrepreneurs. And where do you get the money for something that needs to be sizable? Well, to cut a long story short, in the UK, we managed to persuade the government to let us use unclaimed assets in banks. It turns out that many people in the banking system everywhere in the world become separated from their accounts for one reason or another. They die, they move, they forget, whatever. We persuaded the government of the UK to let us have £400 million of unclaimed assets in the British banking system, where the owner of the capital and the capital had been separated for 15 years or more. And we persuaded, the government had done most of the persuasion, but we persuaded the British banks, the four leading British banks, to add another £200 million of equity. Today, Big Society Capital, which I chair, has equity of £600 million, $1 billion. It's charged with the mission of transforming social investment, of connecting the social sector to the capital markets. And what is the vision a few years from now? What is the vision that Big Society Capital, of which I'm non-executive chairman, Nick O'Donoghue of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs is the CEO, what is the vision that we're trying to bring about? The vision is that 10 years from now, hello? The vision is that 10 years from now, there should be, in the UK, a large number of social investment organizations, just like there are large numbers of venture capitalists. There should be some social investment organizations which are focusing on providing equity or debt to not-for-profit businesses. What we are calling today in the UK Social Entrepreneurs Fund. They would be capable of achieving maybe a 5% return on that money. It's the first step after philanthropy. An organization can raise philanthropic money and then can go to a social entrepreneurs fund and say, look, this is as much philanthropic money as I can raise. I need something like equity, which is very junior debt with a high level of risk. I can't afford to pay a high level of return. This is one difference with the private sector when equity is involved. And if you can provide me with this money, I am prepared to have my social outcomes measured and to prove to you that I'm doing a good job. We can see in the UK today 6 or 8 social investment firms I don't think it's from here. That's the recording one. Battery low, battery low. Here we go. Hello? Okay, can you hear me? Right. Gives you a chance to breathe with this torrent of words coming at you. So today we can see 6 or 8 social investment firms in the UK focusing on what we call social entrepreneurs funds. And this is the starting point for the Tandem Fund, which Benny and Itzik and Eric and Michal are involved in leading in Israel for IVN. The concept here is to begin to provide capital to organizations that have the capacity to scale. Not-for-profit organizations with ambitious management and effective ways of dealing with a particular issue. So we can see 6 or 8 in the UK. I would say the size of these funds in the UK will end up being about £25 million, so about nearly $40 million. They'll have proper professional teams. And in the question and answer period, I can give you examples of what they would do. But perhaps I'll give you one example from the Bridges Entrepreneurs Fund. There's an organization in the UK which has a contract with government to transport disabled people and the elderly, okay? Mainly in poorer areas of London. The Bridges Fund and the Big Issue Fund, 2 of these social entrepreneurs fund, have provided them with about £5 million of debt, junior debt. It has no collateral, no property, no nothing behind it. To the extent that the sales increase, the rate of interest on the debt increases. Very simple mechanism. Maybe the outcome, this is a very successful business. It now has about, it had £23 million of sales when we invested. It now has about £32 million of sales. It will continue to increase. It will become, in my view, a very powerful organization because it's led by an outstanding man called Di Powell, who is on the board of Big Society Capital, which I'll talk about. Just to give you the human dimension of this, Di had a terrible speech impediment. He couldn't speak clearly. So he did very badly at school, okay? He left school without any qualifications at 16, and he started to wash cars in Hackney. Some of the cars that he ended up washing were these buses transporting these people, disabled people and elderly people. Today he has an organization of 800 people with the sales that I was talking about, has lost his speech impediment and has become, in fact, one of the most eloquent proponents of social investment. Okay? So I congratulate IVN on its initiative. IVN is seeking to raise £5 million in an interesting structure, which is an evergreen structure. You'll be hearing more about it today. So the foundations that would donate to IVN would be donating into an activity that would be able to maintain the value of the capital over time and continually support the development of social organizations. So we can see social entrepreneurs funds clearly. The next thing that we can see is social impact bonds. So when an organization like HTC, which is the bus organization I was talking about, has raised as much equity as it can say, I'll raise a social impact bond. Social impact bonds, we are aiming to achieve 7% on. If we can achieve 7% on social impact bonds, then we can achieve a 3 to 5% allocation on the $23 trillion that exist in the world. I mean, it really is that big. But the social organizations, including those in this room, have to be able to deliver the social objectives that correlate to the financial return that pays 7%. And it's the early days for it, like the early days of technology investing. And so we need to do that. But I think looking ahead 10 years, we will be talking of tens of billions. Today, microfinance is about a $40 billion activity. This would be a new asset class for those who come from the financial business within alternative investments, within the absolute return part of alternative investments. And then you will have the social venture funds. And the social venture funds, and Dualis, I guess, here in Israel, has been leading, Hanoch Barkat, my ex-partner, has been leading in this area in trying to find profit with purpose businesses. Businesses that have a dual objective of making a profit and of achieving a social return. Bridges today has 300 million pounds under management. So we went from 40 million to 300 million in 10 years. Same rate, by the way, that Apax went. Apax today manages $40 billion. So there's hope. So Bridges is keen to expand into Israel. It's prepared to share its name and its expertise. There are different aspects, though, to the profit with purpose model. There are different levels of rate of return, financial return, that you can achieve. Hanoch is seeking to achieve lower rates of return than Bridges. The Bridges concept is the financial return is the locomotive. You maximize the return. You focus on a theme, education, health, or you focus on a place, the poorest 25%, the peripheria, or however else you define it, and you maximize the return. So within social venturing, you're going to find funds which seek to achieve different levels of social and financial return. So those are three constituencies of investment managers. Within 10 years, you'll have a social stock exchange. Big Society Capital has already invested in London in a team that is creating a stock exchange to list these securities. Social impact bonds will be traded. When I was in the United States talking about this a year ago, I was talking to somebody in Wall Street, and after a little while the chap said to me, "Aren't you worried about these bonds being sold short?" So I said, well, look, the day we can worry about the bonds being sold short means there's a real market in them. We'll be happy to tackle the question then. But it does have a need for liquidity. Many pension funds cannot invest in illiquid securities. Once you've got a listing, they can invest in it. So I come now to the end of my comments, which is the question of, having given you the perspective for this whole activity, having given you the perspective for what we're doing in the UK and in some other places, what should we be doing in Israel? Now, Israel has a lot of social issues. We all know that. Israel also has a lot of people who are deeply concerned about dealing with social issues. Israel is very innovative. Israel knows how to improvise. Israel is capable of leading in this area. It feels exactly the same to me as 1993 when I started Apax in Israel. Today, Apax has invested in Israel $2.5 billion. Some of the investments have had more notoriety after I have left, like Tnuva. I left after the Bezek transaction, which fortunately ended well for us. But Bezek, Tnuva, Psagot, and a lot of high-tech firms, basically. I can see the same potential here. Where do we start? Well, we start with specific funds in any of the three areas that I talked about. So, social entrepreneurs funds like the Tandem Fund, social venture funds like the Dualis Fund, social impact bond funds, which would invest in social impact bond issues, which is what social finance is trying to do. You start with the creation of social finance, which the Portland Trust, with the help of Benny and Itzik and Michal and Yossi Tamir of the Joint, and a very large number of people, including Yad HaNadiv and Didi Lachman-Messer, too many people to list, but a very powerful group of people, has had a similar set of meetings over the last year, 18 months, as we had in the Social Investment Task Force in the UK. We've now decided to create Social Finance Israel. We've recruited Yaron Neudorfer, who is in the audience somewhere, to be the CEO. A year before, roughly, we'd recruited Ophir Shimshon, who comes from an investment banking background or hedge fund background. And we are embarked now on creating 2 or 3 social impact bond issues of about $5 million each. The government has given us approval in principle, at least the Prime Minister has, for a Haredi bond to help Haredim get into employment. We would like to do an Arab bonds to help Arabs get into employment. And we would like to do an education bond that takes underprivileged kids and brings them through to employment, whether it's through the army into employment or through army and university to employment. 3. We would like to issue 3 social impact bonds. We'd like to issue them if we can. It depends on government, obviously, because government has to sign up, contract to pay on results. But we think we can raise the capital for $15 million of bonds. We'd like to do that within a year of now, if we can. And social finance will subsequently try to launch a social impact bond fund. This would be a fund to invest in further social impact bond issues, which it issues, but which others may issue. And then the big question mark for all of you is, can we get big society capital? Can we get a social investment banking wholesaler going in Israel? Can we use unclaimed assets, maybe from the Kupot Gemel, in order to fund them, given that bank accounts are already taken by the Apotropos HaKlali? I believe that a social investment bank wholesaler is a crucial part of the structure. But we do not have the answer yet. We need to speak with government, and all of you need to get involved in giving us your ideas of what sorts of unclaimed assets exist and how easily we may be able to persuade the government to liberate them. So I hope I've given you a sense of what is behind this effort and how important it is, how things have moved in the United Kingdom over the last dozen years, and how quickly things are beginning to move here in Israel. And with that, I'll be delighted to answer your questions. Thank you very much. אפשר לשאול בעברית, דרך אגב, זה בסדר. תגיד מי אתה בבקשה.
Morning. Very inspiring. Avi Fogel, I'm an IVN board member from New York. Thanks for the inspiring words. The idea of trying to present a financial alternative to the current way social things are working, like the re-incarceration of or re-offense by prison populations in Britain, is inspiring. How do you do that maybe you can give us some ideas regarding education. How do you find a financial alternative?
So wherever you can have quantification of the outcome, you can use social impact bonds. So you can't use them for everything. But in education, actually, whether it is truancy, days of attendance at school, whether it's attainment levels in examinations, whether it is graduation at primary school level or high school level or university level, you actually have very objective measures. The thing with education is to be able to define within the structure of the education system what types of organizations, what types of not-for-profits would be able to achieve progress, right? Now, where you have a highly unionized teacher population, you need to find a way with the unions, which ought to be sympathetic to these types of approaches, to structure something which can improve performance. Now, it may involve performance measurement, which the trade unions may not be in favor of, in which case you've got to persuade them that they ought to be in favor of it. But education is actually a very good application for it. Health is a very good application, whether it's the elderly living at home instead of being in state-funded accommodation, or whether it's admissions through the emergency department of hospitals, rather than care, by doctors outside. Homelessness, the main cost, a big cost of homelessness is through the hospital system, because homeless people are constantly in and out of the emergency wards at very high cost. There may be models which make it cheaper. We've got experts in affordable housing in the audience. Make it cheaper to house homeless people and train them to get into employment than it is to fund constantly their medical treatment and all the other costs, the social benefits and so on that they get, the unemployment benefits. So wherever you can have quantification of outcomes, you can use social impact bonds. There are huge parts of the social sector where it's impossible to quantify. Museums, I sit on the board of the British Museum. Unless you are prepared to say that a proxy for the quality of the museum is the number of people who visit it, it's very difficult to know how you would improve. Sorry, how you would make
return visits rather than first.
Return visits, right? Repeat visits, if you could manage to track them. Other questions? Sorry. There's some. Can somebody go with a? Please.
תודה. אני מה-IVN, ויש לי שאלה לגבי ה-social impact bonds. בישראל היו שני ניסיונות שלא בצורה של בונד, אבל בצורה של הפרטה. לטפל גם בנושא של תעסוקה, בית ויסקונסין, וגם בנושא של בית כלא, שבסוף בג"ץ ביטל את זה. והטענה הייתה, והחשש היה שבסופו של דבר, מי שיפעיל את התוכניות האלה, יסתכל על הדברים מהזווית של הכסף ולא מהזווית החברתית. אז איך אתם...
Okay. Oh, okay. So do you want to give it around when people want? Thank you. Hello. Okay, אז שאלה מאוד טובה, מאוד חשובה. יש הבדל גדול. There's a big difference between not-for-profits that are seeking to do this, which is the case in the Peterborough bond in the UK, and for-profits. There is a big role to play for profit with purpose businesses, undoubtedly. Maybe it'll be even bigger than the social sector in the end, because you'll change the mindsets of businesses to adopt social goals as well as financial goals. In the United States, benefit corporations have been set up to allow a company to have both these goals without getting sued by its shareholders for not maximizing profits. Started in California, as a matter of fact. If you're interested in that, I can go further into it. What we've been talking about so far for social impact bonds is only not-for-profits. The challenge is to fund social organizations that have only a social objective. Okay? To the extent that they can manage to deliver an economic return which is paid for by a saving which government is making, It's a win-win situation. Not-for-profits, I've asked myself the same question. If you look ahead 10 years, what will be the competitive advantage of not-for-profits over for-profits, or vice versa? The competitive advantage of not-for-profits is this. When you go to speak to a prisoner, the first question he asks you is, who is making money out of this? And if you say, it's philanthropic, we're here to help you, you have a big psychological advantage over somebody who says, well, you know, we're making a profit out of it, but we're here to help you, etc. The second competitive advantage is the community is much more prepared to help you than if you're a for-profit. It helps you in different ways. It helps you philanthropically, it helps you with pro bono services, and, you know, and so on and so forth. So I have not focused, and you're right to raise it, I've not focused on funds that invest in for-profit, with purpose businesses. But at Big Society Capital, this is not for publication, please. At Big Society Capital, I'm asking myself the question, why shouldn't we have a separate pool of capital that we can invest in profit with purpose businesses? I can see a big role for this. And we are seeing fund managers coming. You'll be amazed at the innovation that is beginning to bubble up now. One of the innovations is investment managers like Benny or Itzik or Hanoch coming to us and saying, we want to do both. We want to invest 50% of the money in not-for-profit, say, and 50% in for-profit with purpose businesses. So we need to get, you know, we need to get our heads around how do we cope with the issue of profit with purpose. But in what we're discussing here, we're talking about social organizations, many of them small, like Israeli tech companies were in 1993, who think they've got an effective way to deal with a social issue, and who say, look, instead of dealing just locally, I want to deal across the country with this issue. עוד שאלה? כן, בבקשה.
שוקר.
מיכל.
IVN. I'll give you the speaker. As I said, it's very inspiring and amazing what you've done there in the UK. We are concerned in our ability to do it here because the major concern is the Israeli government and the government ministries. Not so much the Prime Minister, maybe even some ministers will support it, but the entire organization is usually scared of innovation. See what happened with Kipat Mazel till it happened. So how do you have some guidance for us how to get this buy-in?
Right. Well, listen, it's a very important question. So far as we're concerned, we at the Portland Trust, working with the Milken Foundation, which I should have mentioned earlier, Glenn, with Yad HaNadiv, with the Joint, with the Skoll Foundation, we see our role at the Portland Trust as helping to develop the social investment marketplace. And so we would like to join forces with all those in this hall and elsewhere who have influence with government. It's a very important thing. We see social finance today as an independent organization from the Portland Trust, in which the Portland Trust is well represented, etc., which is focused on the development of social impact bonds. So Yaron will be working very closely with the Portland Trust and with all of you to try to get the same change of mindset. Now, it is true that the first social impact bond, which was launched by the Ministry of Justice, was launched with a minister I knew. It is true, Jack Straw, I hope, had greater faith, because I was involved in it, that the money would be raised and that the returns would eventually happen. To tell you that everybody in the Ministry of Justice was convinced from the first minute is wrong. In his first meeting, Jack Straw thumped the table and said to his officials, I know nothing should ever be done for the first time, but we're going to try this. Okay? So there is an issue there is an issue about how do you get government buy-in. The answer is you go for ministers or heads of the civil service, more importantly in Israel, than, as you was hinting, than the ministers, who believe that, look, we need innovation in the way we're approaching this. And we've been working with Glenn, who over the past few years, Glenn Yago, all of you probably know from the Milken Institute, has been working over the past few years to train young civil servants in the ways of modern finance and social investment and other disciplines. The reaction that we are getting today, speaking with some of the ministries, I think are encouraging. If we can keep things simple, it will be a lot better. I think when you come with very complicated financial structures, which in this area you could begin to imagine with 4 layers of investor, 4 layers of equity, 4 layers of return, all this sort of thing, it'll become very complicated. But if you keep it very simple, government pays on results, pays out of savings that it should have achieved, and government can judge whether down the line it wants to adopt these ways and stop social impact bonds in this area, just government departments change their policy, or allows it to run. If government begins to perceive this as innovation in Israel, I think that's a very important button to press, because in tech we proved against all the odds that we're capable of innovating more than anywhere else.
About one final question, and after that we'll need to wrap up.
My name is Ronnie Dellins. I have a question. It seems that there's a tremendous educational challenge here to educate the business community at large that this is a new paradigm. It's a completely different way of doing it. What has your experience been in England, elsewhere in the world, that can help us here in Israel to bring that paradigm to the population?
Okay. So it is a change of mindset. And as you say, it's challenging because it's a change of mindset of government, of social organizations, of investors, of regulators, like the Charity Commission, and so on and so forth. That's the reason we've gone global immediately. That's the reason we started Social Finance Israel, US first, and Social Finance Israel now. That's the reason I'm traveling to Australia, and I traveled to Canada and broadcast to Germany. I couldn't go there, I had to do it by video conference. If we can manage to do it globally, it provides the greatest consolidation of those who are persuaded that this can work. So when Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs came out with a social impact bond, it had immediate effect in the UK. The UK could say, we led in this, and look, it's being picked up by very serious people, and we're going to have to run in order to stay in the lead as a country, and you begin to get all the normal juices of competition flowing. But there is a major challenge in explaining this. As you can see, it's taken me half an hour to give you the background for it. We need a 30-second elevator pitch. Today, if you say to somebody, look, we found a way of funding not-for-profits through the savings that government makes as a result of the work of these not-for-profits, it doesn't really connect yet. So we need to begin to create examples. We need to be able to say, it's the Peterborough bond. Government saved, the not-for-profit got capital. Prisoners are leading better lives. We need to get to proof. So in a way, I think we've passed the persuasion phase, and we're now into the evidence phase. What we need now is evidence. That's why if we can create the tandem fund, if Dualis can increase the size of its fund, if we can launch 2 or 3 social impact bond issues, that will be the best way of beginning to change the mindset. And with that, I think we've finished. Thank you very much.